it's really great to be in Kingston. It's very nice and lovely city, and to be a part of this discussion. And I will start with a disclaimer that I present solely my own views, and this views shouldn't be attributed to Livermore National Lab. So in my presentation, I will talk or feed into the discussion which was started by General Bose about the need for understanding ourselves, and I will expand a little bit what Jeff and Paul said about how difficult and messy deterrence is, without downgrading its role. And in particular, I will focus on challenges to U.S. extended deterrence. And to start with a brief definition of how I understand U.S. extended deterrence. So it is a form of the U.S. security guarantee given to select treaty allies, so in particular NATO member states, Japan and South Korea, with some lack of clarity concerning Australia, that the U.S. will use all possible means, including nuclear weapons, to prevent aggression or coercion against them. So nuclear is a part of it, but it's not the only element. And I talk about extended deterrence more broadly. And I think this conference is a testimony to that deterrence, but also U.S. extended deterrence has returned to center stage. And it first became evident in Northeast Asia about more a decade ago, and then since 2014 in Europe. And the strategy documents produced by the Trump administration list extended deterrence as one of the top U.S. priority in the age of return of great power competition. Extended deterrence has an inherent credibility problem, as argued by Thomas Schelling, was quoted by Jeff before, in contrast to central deterrence, which is about deterring an attack on one's own homeland. Making extended deterrence appear credible is incomparable harder. And I think to make matters worse, extended deterrence has been fraught with challenges which somehow exacerbated the credibility problem. So first, the US and its allies have had different assessments of what is required for extended deterrence to be effective. Second, US extended deterrence has been accompanied by recurring allied concerns about US reliability and US complaints that the allies are free-riding. And third, sending a message of cohesion was difficult given differences between the US and its allies on some major policy, but also economic issues. And the return of extended deterrence also means that the return of these three challenges, which I argue are inherent to extended deterrence relationship. And of course, potential adversaries are continue to be eager to exploit all these challenges. And during the rest of my presentation, I will discuss these three challenges, and I will conclude with some recommendations on the way forward for the United States and its allies. So let's focus now on the first challenge. So historically, there have been differences between the allies about requirements of extended deterrence, both in terms of extended deterrence hardware, so capabilities, but also extended deterrence software, so consultations, planning, exercises, declaratory policy, overall strategy. And assessing the requirements for extended deterrence has been difficult because the effectiveness of extended deterrence depends on perceptions of three different actors. So first, potential aggressors must feel deterred, and it's something which is not possible to assess with certainty. Second, allies must be reassured about the US commitment and must believe that enough was done to keep the potential aggressor at bay. And third, I think it's often overlooked, is that the United States must be self-confident that it is able to meet its commitments. And reconciling these three different audiences, their needs, has been very difficult in the past, as the goals of each of the audience or these perceptions were not often in sync and in fact were in conflict. So what was giving US self-confidence was not necessarily reassuring to US allies and vice versa. So the classic formulation of extended deterrence dilemma is so-called the Healy theorem. So in the words of a former British Defense Secretary, Dennis Healy, it took only 5% credibility of American retaliation to deter an attack, but 95% credibility to reassure the allies. Still, I think that the Healy theorem capture only a part of the dilemma. So while in some cases the credibility of extended deterrence was questioned by the European allies, in some cases it was the United States who perceived deterrence credibility gaps. So the Cold War provides numerous examples. So throughout the 1960s, the US advocated for a flexible response strategy driven by a lack of US self-confidence about the massive retaliation, and this met stark opposition from European allies, and it took some time for flexible response to be adopted. The 1979 NATO dual-track decision was initially driven by European concerns about nuclear imbalance in Europe, and the initial US reaction was actually that existing strategic system and forces deployed in Europe were enough. Only after some time the US became a driver for deployments of IRBMs in Europe. And if we look at the situation today, in recent years, beginning with the Obama administration, the United States, together with regional allies, have made significant progress in strengthening regional extended deterrence architecture. But still, despite this progress, I think US and its allies are still in the process of coming to terms with requirements of extended deterrence. And what we see today, at least in some areas, that the United States is pushing for some extended deterrence upgrades. So in particular, in the nuclear area, the Trump administration is planning supplemental nuclear capability in response to a perceived nuclear deterrence gap with Russia. And while the supplemental capabilities are welcomed by Japan as a means to strengthen extended deterrence in East Asia, European allies have been either silent or skeptical about the need for the capabilities, at least if we look at the public discussion. So let's now turn to the second challenge. So allies' recurring doubts about US reliability and US complaints about allied burden sharing. So again, historically, US allies have been oscillating between concerns that the US abandons them or entraps them in a conflict. So the classic expression of fear of abandonment is the statement made by French President de Gaulle that the United States would not sacrifice New York to save Paris or Bonn. Also, like, US allies have been anxious that the US engagement in the other region would divert US strategic attention away from Europe. And when it comes to fears of entrapment, there were recurring fears that irresponsible actions by the US would unnecessarily escalate tensions or would drag allies into a catastrophic war. So I think it's interesting that the Korean War, so at the time when at the beginning of NATO, like somehow shows how Allied concerns, anxieties about abandonment rapidly turned into fears of entrapment. So the early elation in Western Europe about the US resolve to defend South Korea against North Korea rapidly transformed into what the US Secretary of State Dean Acheson characterized as petrified fright. So NATO allies were concerned that the war would drain US resources from Europe and that US actions would lead to World War III, including nuclear use. And these concerns about reliability were not one-sided. So since the Korean War, the US has frequently complained, and using President Kennedy's words, that, quote, the US cannot continue to pay for the military protection of Europe, whilst the NATO states are not paying their fair share and living off fat of the land. So it's not new. And if we look at today's situation, the Trump administration intensified US complaints about unfair burden sharing with perhaps unorthodox way to make Europeans and others to pay more. Moreover, under the Trump administration, I think the classic alliance security dilemma, the tension between being abandoned and being entrapped, has also intensified both in Europe and in the Asia-Pacific region. So a number of statements by Donald Trump, President Trump, led to anxieties about the future of alliance relationships and alliance policies. And despite reassuring statements by President himself, but also members of the U.S. administration, but also concrete actions and investments on the ground, I think that some lingering concerns are still remain. So let's now turn to my third point, which is that maintaining credible extended deterrence has been challenging because of the differences between the allies on some major policy and economic issues. So because of these differences, maintaining cohesion and sending a cohesive signal to the outside world has been difficult. So again, if we look at the past, so again, the Korean War provides a good example. So frustrated about U.S. policies during the war, the British Prime Minister at the time said in 1950 that the UK must continue to save the US from themselves. There are other crises in transatlantic relations. So the 1956 Suez Crisis, the October 1973 Yom Kippur War, which, according to the commentaries at the time, strained US-European relations almost to the breaking point. There were some transatlantic tensions during the first Reagan term. And I think that during the entire Cold War, the changing global economy led to periodic tensions between the US and its allies over monetary or trade policies, so including the Nixon shock and trade dispute during the Reagan administration. I think that after the recent G7 summit, it goes without saying that the growing role of extended deterrence is accompanied by growing differences between the US and its allies on climate change, tariffs on steel and aluminium, and of course the future of the JCPOA, so nuclear deal with Iran. And this brings me to some conclusions. So I think that the most pressing task for the US and its allies, I think, is to somehow relearn to live with and to manage these challenges, which I think are inherent to extended deterrence. And despite all the significant challenges and divisions between the US and its allies during the Cold War, I think they managed to overcome them. and adversaries were not able to exploit these divisions and challenges, and periods of tensions were followed by periods of consensus building and strengthening of alliance cooperation. I think that this, of course, shouldn't lead to complacency, but I think it should energize our efforts, or allies' effort, to preserve a strong alliance relationship and thus extended deterrence. And I think that the allies' willingness to maintain cohesion and find consensus despite the differences, I think it's the foundation of credible extended deterrence, and I will stop here. Thank you.